Hey, everybody, and welcome to Expanding Federal Power Part 2. In this video, I am going to discuss specifically the Interstate Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution, which was referenced in the Part 1 video. So, the Constitution gives Congress the authority to regulate interstate commerce. And, that was in the original Constitution. And basically, that meant that things that passed over state lines, instrumentalities of commerce, the channels of commerce, highways, rivers that travel from state to state, Congress could regulate that. And that sort of makes sense because as things pass from state to state, there needs to be a certain level of continuity so that an item can get from state A to state B safely, efficiently, without a lot of legal interruptions and hurdles. Now, in the early 1900s, there was a case called Wickard versus Filburn. The person in that case was but he was growing wheat on his property for personal consumption. Okay, that's what he was doing. I think he had a farm that he grew and sold, but then he also had a separate area where he grew wheat just for his personal household consumption. There was a law at the time that essentially prohibited that. And he challenged the law, saying Congress, and it was a federal law, so not a state law, but a federal law, and he challenged it, saying this does not affect interstate commerce at all. This is my personal wheat that I'm growing for personal consumption. Well, the United States Supreme Court held that Congress did have the authority to do that because, and the way they reasoned it, this is somewhat of an oversimplification, but it'll suffice for today's purposes. If everybody grew their own wheat, then that would affect the price of wheat in the marketplace. And what they were attempting to do was regulate supply and demand and pricing of wheat at that time, sort of as a price control measure. So the Supreme Court developed this concept of aggregation when doing an interstate commerce clause analysis. We don't just look at whether the physical wheat itself crosses state lines, whether it's sold interstate, purchased by an out-of-state participant. They will look at if everybody did what this particular plaintiff is doing, would it have any effect whatsoever on interstate commerce? And they ruled that it did. Sometimes you don't necessarily agree with the outcome of a case, but you understand and agree with the rationale, the reasoning. To this day, and even when I first learned about this case in law school, to this day, I just fundamentally disagree with the Supreme Court on this particular issue. I disagree at all that is at all what our founding fathers intended when they drafted the Interstate Commerce Clause. I disagree that it's appropriate to look at something in the aggregate. If everybody did something, would it affect interstate commerce? Because that almost completely vitiates the purpose of the Interstate Commerce Clause. Meaning, there's almost nothing that the federal government can't regulate if you look at it that way. And clearly, understanding the intent of the framers was not to give the federal government practically unlimited ability and authority to regulate things. So I think this was a stretch. I think they were under immense pressure. And what interestingly, they held either as part of that case or that case's progeny, which is the cases that sort of stem from that. They said that, limits on what the federal government should do should be enforced through the voting polls, and that it's more of a political question. And so if the citizens don't like, this, then they can vote people out of office. Well, I think that's inappropriate. I mean, the Constitution is there as a limit. The Constitution is there for a reason. So it's hard to undo that ruling because of the concept of stare decisis, which means you let the decision stand. You don't overturn a case precedent that's already been decided by the Supreme Court, except under very limited circumstances. I think that's an incorrect rationale for why you should let something stand that you even give lip service to the fact that you, talking about Supreme Court, you recognize the problem in this ruling, but basically say, well, the citizens in their election process can remedy this. Well, no, they can't. No, they can't. And they shouldn't have to. You should do your job and you should interpret the Constitution the way it was drafted. Ever since Wickard v. Filburn, and there's been an explosion of federal regulation, and much of today's expanding federal government can be traced back to the Wickard v. Filburn decision. Specifically, the federal criminalization of, let's say, marijuana. That's the way they are able to regulate marijuana, even though someone who grows it and consumes it, grows it on their own land, uses it for personal consumption, doesn't sell it to anybody, they cite Wickard v. Filburn for that. So that is how the federal government is able to expand its reach. So for people that are wondering, well, what could we do to shrink the federal government? What could we do? What you would need is a constitutional amendment that essentially overturns Wickard v. Filburn and actually give more parameters to the Interstate Commerce Clause and actually amend the Interstate Commerce Clause to make it more narrow. If you did that through a constitutional amendment, that's the only thing that could undo that, what I believe to be an incorrectly decided Supreme Court decision.